and everyone else who made this film. I think it's just so powerful and great to have your voices, and it will be a really fantastic tool for all of us in advocacy. I want to just pass out an article that we meant to put upstairs that Margot Wallström wrote from Sweden last year in support of New York legal reform efforts, that was published in the Albany Times-Union. So we'll pass that out. And for people on Zoom, welcome to all of you. And we'll put a link in the chat so that you can also access that. And let me now invite our distinguished panel to come and take a seat, and I will turn it over to Taina Bien-Aimé. Thanks. I also just wanted to welcome Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who has joined us and who has really just been an incredible champion on this issue and was instrumental in passing the 2000 Trafficking Victim Protection Act, and has so much legislation to protect women in so many ways. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much as my papers fly, because I'm clapping for Carolyn. Thank you. Welcome, Carolyn. We miss you dearly. Thank you all for coming tonight, and special applause go to Melanie, the star of the movie. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start my question with Melanie, since this is your pride and joy right now, and then I'd like to have each of you sort of have a reaction to the movie before we continue the panel. So, Melanie, how was the journey making this film?
It was definitely a long journey. Myself and the other two survivors there, we started this project last March. Nope. Yes, last March, because we didn't pass March yet. And really just did it within, I think, 6 or 8 months. And really, this entire video, this idea for this film came because of the debate that I mentioned in the film. And it's become extremely frustrating to continuously try to prove to society how harmful the sex trade is. And, you know, for all of us up here, I think we can all say that it's a no-brainer for us. But society is still stuck in a lot of different ways. And I think that I wanted to find a way to bring just a minute number of survivors together to have a conversation about these complexities and how harmful it is, and really get people to understand why I believe that the equality model is the only approach that we can have when it comes to approaching the system of prostitution and the sex trade. So it's been a long journey, but I'm proud of it.
Well, thank you. Congratulations. Cristián, what's your first reaction to the film? Is this the first time you see it?
No, it's my third time that I'm seeing it.
Okay.
But I really like it. I really impressed by the rawness of the survivors of sharing their stories. And it's very interesting for me that when survivors we speak about our experiences, we always include like a more realness on it. Like we speak about like what was happening to us, like if there was like a third-party component or a trafficker or a pimp, and we talk about the sex buyers, and that's something that I don't see people talk about. I think that we have normalized it on a point that is like, well, it's okay to buy people just because you have money and you know you can dispose of them. You have money, you can buy them, you can do whatever you want to them, so it's fine. And on top of that, like for me, it's very interesting that they were sharing like what was happening to them, what they were doing to them, because I feel that we have been shy in a way of like telling what sex buyers do to us. Like I hear a lot of times like, but by keeping sex buyers accountable, we are going like to affect our communities and all these things. And just a reminder to everyone that if you, survivors of sex trafficking, we are survivors of sexual assault, rape, a lot of times of, sometimes we almost are on the brink of death. Like, the reality is that we don't know if the sex buyer is the one who is going to kill us, if the sex buyer is the one who is going to rape us until we are bleeding, until death, if the sex buyer is going to use a knife, like, to literally, like, just, like, end our life. Like, that's the reality of the sex trade. It's not about, like, just coming in and out and, you know, like, this sex buyer that is going to be like, what are your pronouns, what are your name, tell me your story. Like, that is not the reality. Like, you really, when a sex buyer came, you don't know what it's going to happen to you. And I don't think that in any activity in the world, any human experience something similar to this. And you are not in risk of homicide. You are not in risk of being, like, killed. Like, you don't have, like, this high stress, anxiety, and so, like, literally, like, try to label this activity as a job and just minimizing the impact of it, like, and also at the same time minimizing what survivors are saying. It's very, like, I don't know, like, it's shocking to me, because I believe that a lot of times we think that New York or the United States, like, we are the best on human rights and all these things, and I'm like, we are failing really bad at recognizing that prostitution is a system that is thriving on oppression, that is thriving on exploiting people, on exploiting the most vulnerable. And at the end of the day, when people, and even on, it's like rooted on ageism, like, when people reach certain age, like, if you are too, I'm sorry about the words, if you are too loose, if you are too used, if you are ugly, like, you're going to get disposed, like, you don't serve anymore. And that's the reality. And I think that it was what they were telling, like, on the movie, like, all about, like, how sex buyers are preying on the most vulnerable and continue preying on the most vulnerable. And we need to start to continue and to start talking about these things, because these are the reality. The reality is not that, you know, like, oh, people on the sex trade, they become rich and they are traveling all around the world. Like, how many? 1 out of million, maybe? Maybe. Prostitution, I think there is a spectrum, like, probably there is 1 out of million. And that person, the reality is that walking on the bones and the dead bodies of thousands of us. That's the reality. And I cannot ignore that. So the movie really makes me think about that, makes me think about my situation, that I know that when I was being trafficked, I wasn't the only one, that there were people before me. I heard names. I didn't know what happened to them. And I go to live with these consequences my whole life. Like, even if I'm going to therapy, to counseling, like, there are days that I'm like, wow, I don't even know how I survived. Like, and I think that all survivors, we face that day after day. Like, we have nightmares, we have anxiety, like, and it's very hard to navigate the world. So I'm really proud of the people who made this movie. And yes, I think that it's very, very important to keep talking about accountability and sex buyers.
Thank you, Cristian.
You can hear me. Thank you, Melanie, Eduardo. Both of you do so much work telling your stories. You have to do it over and over. And that's one of the things that we see in our work constantly, that we're trying to get the message out to so many people. You know, what I'd like for you to understand is the environment here in New York and other places across the country. There is this movement to fully decriminalize the sex trade. You have respectable Democratic clubs and other clubs that put it on their questionnaires for candidates. Do you support full decriminalization? The Jamal's Club here in New York actually makes you then go further to say, and you oppose the equality model. So there's a lot of pressure on electeds. There's a big push that has happened with the Democratic Communists of US, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. And, you know, they're very aggressive. They're very aggressive. And, you know, what I'm trying to do is learn ways to talk about this issue that I can talk to people at their level where they are. I realized that I had been talking about it from my perspective. And so I'm trying out new things. And this is just for you an exercise to think about, because these are hard conversations to have. And I'm talking about how the root of this is male privilege. If you support a labor movement and worker rights, how do you see this as a sustainable, safe workplace or job? You can't. You absolutely can't. This is where, and male sexual privilege intersects with women's inequality. In the legislation that's in the New York legislature right now for full decriminalization, they actually have put in their message in there. They have said, going back to this old idea that we have to do away with this antiquated idea, put people before moral judgment, as if that's what we're here about. I mean, it's absolutely incredible the amount of trafficking that happens here, the amount of prostitution to young people, to anybody. The minute anybody is down on their luck, there is a system in place that's ready to exploit you. I'm gonna stop right now because I know we're short on time, and I definitely want to hear from you and get to some of your questions, Taina.
Much. Thank you for inviting me to stay in this historical building, because I'm here for a few weeks. And I think we should be reminded of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, because it says that all humans are free and equal, but also that they should not be held in slavery or servitude. And I think we must go back to that. Actually, the Swedish law that was enacted on the 1st of January 1999 came after a couple of decades with a very lively debate on gender equality in Sweden. There were discussions about whether we needed a women's political party. We had discussions on equal pay for equal work. We talked a lot about parenthood and shared parenthood, that the role of men ought to be changed. And we also addressed the issue of violence against women. And very much of prostitution comes with violence against women and has a kind of element of violence all the time. So this was behind the new legislation that we passed in Sweden. And the ban on the purchase of sexual acts is central to our efforts to reduce the demand for prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes. And it came into force, as I said, in 1999. And we were the first country in the world to criminalize the purchase, but not the sale of sex. And that is, of course, an understanding of exactly what you have described in this movie, the background of those people that end up in prostitution, the background, the inequalities that lies behind all of this. And it is now listed in the criminal code. I'm reading because I want to be sure about using the right legal terms also, but it is now listed in the criminal code under sexual offenses. So it's a sex crime. Buyers can receive a sentence up to 1 year imprisonment, and that was changed recently from fines to actually imprisonment. And all forms of procuring are also further illegal, and was also before the law in 99. Regulating this exploitation as work has never been an option. It is not work. And I know that others have asked, should you also be compelled then to do this work, as often is part of any social movement, that people can be asked to, if they are going to be paid by the state, then you have to fulfill certain, you have to try different forms of work. So should this be part of that? And everybody understands that cannot happen. You cannot see it as work. It's one of the worst intrusions of human integrity that you can experience, and this is what you describe. And I saw some of it when rape is being used as a weapon of war or conflict. And I saw what kind of damage this makes, not only to a person, but to a family, a village, and a whole country in the end. And it lives on for a very, very long time. Now, and it is a highly gendered issue, because a big majority of those in prostitution are women, and a huge majority of the buyers of sex are men. That is exactly what statistics show us. Just to say one word about that, several other countries have followed our example. So that's why it's called sometimes the Nordic model. But Iceland, as well as Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada, Israel, and France, and South Africa, I know, is in the process of adopting it, and Spain as well. What happened? What are the results? What is it that we can say? Because I understand there are so many misrepresentations of this, misunderstandings about the Nordic model or the Swedish model or equality model. What happened was that, of course, that street prostitution has gone down significantly in Sweden, but that has happened everywhere because this has moved to the internet, of course. So that is maybe not only a result of this, but this is what happened immediately, that the street prostitution almost disappeared. There were no signs of enhanced violence or that prostitution has become a more hidden phenomena in society because of this. It has been a very important tool to counteract trafficking, because we can never deny the link between trafficking and prostitution. Because how can you live up to an increased demand? And this is what you will see. This has been the experience of those countries that have made prostitution legal, like Germany and the Netherlands and other countries. And do you think that sort of middle-class Germans think of this as a very good job, that they would insist their children, their daughters take on? No. More than 90% of those who work in these brothels come from countries, well, former Eastern European countries, but from Africa or poor countries around the world. This is where they come from. And of course, this increases the pressure also to get them younger and younger. So exactly what we've said about children. And also the conditions are not what was promised when they made this legal. And we have so much of proof of that. So, and the same goes for Amsterdam, where this has now become a social problem that is enormous. And the mayor of Amsterdam is trying to find ways to get out or control what has now become a sex tourist place. I don't think you would like New York or any other place in the U.S. to become a sex tourism place. So, and I think also, and most importantly, that it has had a normative effect. And also there is huge support, public support for this legislation, and that is of course very important. It is not okay to buy sex, and I think that the normative effect is also something that we should take into our calculation when we judge whether this is an important tool or not. So that's where we are, and of course, everywhere in the world, we should not forget the money, because this is money-driven as well. The enormous amount of money in this these activities. And next to drugs and arms, this is high up on the list of money and money laundering as well. It has not put an end to sexual exploitation, because now we see new phenomena like sugar dating and of course all of these online activities, and that's one thing. But if we would open up to decriminalize also pimping and keeping brothels and all of that, I think we're inviting trafficking, and we are inviting crimes against children, and we will see much more of social problems as well. So that's what I can say at the moment. Sorry for taking long, but
No,
maybe
please.
to
No, this
explain a
is-
little bit. And I think that we need to be able to give a proper description of what has happened also with the Nordic model or the equality model. And I like that name to it, because that's where it stems from. How do you think we can continue to fight for women's rights if we at the same time accept that women's bodies can be sold like a piece of meat in places where, like in Germany, they could offer and make ads about packages where you get a plane ticket, you get a beer, you get some sausages, and you can choose any 3 women in a brothel. I think they've stopped it now because there was an outrage in the end against this. But that's how the advertising goes. So, and at the same time that we really want women and men to enjoy the same legal rights and human rights in society, it does something to our whole understanding of what it is to be a person with dignity, enjoying fully those rights, to be a free and equal person, and to not be in slave or servitude. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question before I open it up to the audience. You talked a lot about culture. Here in New York, it's very acceptable for men to purchase sexual acts, unfortunately. We recently spoke with an assembly member who is a co-sponsor of the Decrim New York bill, who told us that she did not want the immigrant men in her district to be, they're lonely men and they should be allowed to go to brothels. That was her response to us and this was after Cristián and other survivors talked about what sex buyers have done to them. So these are the challenges that we are facing in New York. But in addition to the law, I think the dilemma that we're facing is it's a question of culture. You talked about how the culture shifted in Sweden. And this is a question for all of you, like, prostitution is a harmful cultural practice. And so when we are in a culture that is 100% pornified, where everything can be purchased, women and girls in particular, and trans women, highly sexualized, highly commodified, what is it, how can we shift? And if everybody should have an idea about this, because I think that is really the $50,000 question, is how can we change our culture of commodification?
I'm sure the others have very good answers to that as well, but I do believe that we need to talk about pornography, for example, the role of pornography. And if you understand that most boys in their, around 12 years of age have actually watched porn on the internet. So that's how you maybe get your first idea of what sexuality is and how to exercise. And if you have looked at it, you know that it's very violent. Violence is engaged in and used in most of these scenes. It's very, very violent. It has very little to do with what normally would be a way to explore new feelings of sexual connection with somebody or love. And I think if this is the first thing you learn about that, then you want to try it. And that is also what I understand that many, and I followed with the police one night. So I was out with them a whole night to see what it means to be a police and what you do when you try to catch those sex buyers. And of course, we could see the same pattern as in other countries, that these women were from Nigeria, from Colombia, from Romania, and other places like that. But also that they say that the customers, because you're in the hand of customers, you're in the hands of the demand, those that make the demands. And they say they want to live out things that they see in pornography. And I think we have to realize we have to be able to talk about this. What does it do to us to live in society that is highly sexualized, as you say, and with a lot of pornography that teaches also very young boys what it is? I think we are too afraid, because we know that that's another minefield in many ways to talk about that. You will sound as if you are like... I don't know what you're called, but you know what I mean. So I think we have to have a debate about that as well. But it is getting very evil, very nasty. And if we open up and say it's okay for all those that want to exploit this, to make money from it, what do you think they will do? What do you think will be the effects if you just say, let it free? Who are the ones that will really use it? And they are few, the ones who say that this is a fantastic opportunity for me as a woman. It has liberated me. I can do webcam stuff or whatever. They are not the problem. Let's focus on what is really the big part and those patterns in all. Sorry.
But the issue is that that's all the space, all the public space are the happy faces of OnlyFans, and they're the voices, as opposed to Melanie, why it's so important that you did this film. How do we do that? How do we raise your voices? Because I have faith in people in general. People in general understand fundamentally that prostitution is a harmful cultural practice for so many reasons. And practically, they don't want it in their neighborhoods. They know all the collateral crime that it brings. Right. They have enough time raising their kids. They certainly don't want to have increase the size of the sex market. And all the work that we've done to reshape manhood for our boys, I mean, how do you reckon the Me Too movement and wanting to fully decriminalize the sex trade? You can't. You start, contrasting these things, and where are you left with? You really can't defend it. These very same legislators here in New York who spent a great deal of time and took sexual harassment in the workplace incredibly seriously. They passed laws. But they're the same ones that are pushing for decriminalizing the sex trade. So what does that mean? That means that if you are educated and white and work in an office environment, you'd better not even make a woman uncomfortable. How dare you say anything offensive? But as long as you've got the disposable cash, there's a whole market for you to be able to exploit other women. It makes no sense. And I do have faith that the public and people understand that. And those are our true values. But, there's this bigger question. How do we get the voices of Melanie out there more? And even, last year I tracked at least 10 cases. These were only the ones who made big news. So it is out. I mean, the New York Times had plenty of stories, these large-scale federal investigations that were indicted, went to trial, really incredible cross-jurisdictional cases. But one young woman who was brought in when she was 13 from Mexico, spoke in open court. I mean, 30 men a day. Also, if people realize it's not this glamorized viewpoint, it's not White Lotus. It's what you were talking about, just really brutal. I mean, one of these cases where they have on the wiretap, they have these Asian immigrant women asking for a break from their traffickers, asking for a break. And what they got instead was ice. So these are women who are literally icing down their vaginas. That's the reality of it. It's a 13-year-old girl having 30 men a day. The scope of it is crazy. And just finished on that one case, if people understood how organized, because I think it's this here, this person, one person doing it on their own. It's two consenting adults. That's the biggest barrier we have. But this one case, you had this one crime family, the Hernandez crime family, who was bringing women in. And then you had another crime family here, the Cedez family, who they had the drivers and the book of business and the book of men. I mean, it's organized crime as well.
Say something that I think is super imperative that you just said about like the idea that, you know, when you're in the workplace, we should be respecting women and we should dare not hurt them. But then if you have disposable income, then there's this market and this place that you can go to. And I think going back to your question about how do we start to shift our cultural narrative around this issue, it's recognizing that trafficking and prostitution is not about sex. It's about power, control, and male entitlement. And I think that we as a society, the reason that this debate on whether we should fully decriminalize or whether we should keep criminalization or whatever, I think the reason that that debate is so hard is because of what we're saying about people saying, you know, well, sex workers work and this is a choice and, you know, this is power of autonomy and things of this nature. That's a very privileged perspective. The majority of people that are in the system of prostitution and that have been trafficked are marginalized, vulnerable folks who come from poverty or a lack of resource or a really messed up circumstance. And I think that once we recognize that this is not about sex, this is not about mutual pleasure between two or more persons that are all consenting equally, this is about one person that has the means, another person that has lesser means, and I just bored with my extra money. That's a privileged viewpoint. That's somebody that does not have to figure out where their next meal is coming from, or that's somebody that does not have to choose between work and school or working kids or schooling kids. Like these, like I think that it's really frustrating for me because we as a society keep trying to ride this like empowerment train, and I think especially in a state like New York where we pride ourselves on being so progressive, and we in New York State want to be the first state that is super progressive, that's going to, you know, get ahead of the rest and try to be inclusive of every single person that comes in, which is amazing. However, at what expense? At whose expense? And when we recognize that this isn't about sex and we get back to the root, which is patriarchy, capitalism, racism, sexism, when we get back to those roots and understand that this is about the sexual gratification and the gain of one or more specific people that have an upper hand compared to their counterparts, then I think once we accept that narrative, then our cultural perspective will change. But as long as we see it as somebody's choice, or, oh, they're just lonely. Oh, what about the disabled guy that can't have sex? Or once we recognize that all of this is about fulfilling somebody's desire because they have the money and the means to, then I think once we accept that fully, then we as a society will start to change our perspective on what the sex trade is and recognize that this cannot be a job like any other and this is not empowerment. And we need to do that collectively in order for it to enact change. Otherwise, prostitution is not gonna be reversed or ended in my lifetime.
No, yeah, I think that the first part is like people really need to understand trafficking. I think that still think that if there's no physical retention or like isolation, like there's no trafficking. The reality is that most cases, a lot of cases that we have seen now, there is a lot of coercion. People don't understand what is coercion. Actually, like I really encourage everyone to look out for cases that involve coercion. Coercion is extremely proof to prove in a court case, like even to explain as a survivor to everyone else what is coercion. Coercion threats, it's a big part of it. People really, truly need to understand that part. And one big part of coercion is that you don't know that you are being trafficked. So if you are going out there asking people in the sex trade, are you being trafficked? What do you think they are going to answer? No. So it's something that we need to understand. That's the first thing. We need to do a cultural change, understanding trafficking, the coercion tools, the impact of coercion, and all these challenges that we have to recognize trafficking. There is over trafficking and covert pin control trafficking. So there is familial trafficking, and nobody talks about it. Familial trafficking is happening in high grades here in the United States, and sometimes people are like, familial trafficking, like family trafficking their kids, and yes, family trafficking their kids. This is real. This is happening even right now while we are talking. And the second piece is that I think that we need to start challenging language. Sex work is not work. Prostitution is exploitation. So nothing like sex work is work. It's just like a fire war, like to silence people, like to silence survivors, like to silence like the work of, like the reality is that all the people who probably die being trafficked, like all the women who have been fighting for rights, all the people who fight before me, and it's very sad because prostitution is exploitation. The other part that we need to really fight is when people say like, oh, prostitution is the oldest profession of the world. Like, what? No, like, what are you saying? Like, no, it's the oldest oppression of the world. We need to challenge openly all these statements. And I think that we are very hesitant. We are going to be, oh, I'm going to be canceled and all these things. The reality is that I don't care if I'm going to be canceled. Like, the reality is that I was trafficked. I was on the brink of death, like every 5 minutes. Like, that's the reality. The reality is that I'm here to telling you the truth. People are dying, people are being trafficked, people are being raped, people are being sexually assaulted, because trafficking is linked with femicide, is linked with kidnapping, it's linked with exploitation. It's linked with the lives of people, and this is happening. We are not talking about things, we are not talking about like disposable things, we are talking about peoples and human bodies. We are talking about human beings, and we cannot allow just because someone has money to rape us, to rape the LGBTQ+ community, to rape people like me, immigrants, to rape people who don't speak English, and be like, oh, you know what? We got a group of people for you to enjoy, and literally, if you kill them, we don't care about them, because guess what? They didn't know that they were trafficked, and that's what they desire. So we really need to challenge the language. We really need to challenge these people. And again, sex work is not war. Like, sex work, it's just really, it shouldn't exist. And again, I invite you, everyone, like, to really challenge all these things. Like, prostitution is a really complex issue. People, stop being lazy. Like, just because someone that you know is telling you, like, oh, like, this is progressive, like, that's nonsense. Like, read about, educate yourself, listen to survivors, and stop silencing survivors. Many times, advocates from against sexual assault, advocates from against sexual violence, if they a lot of advocates of against sexual violence are in part of full decrim. They disagree with us. Now they are the bad ones. And guess what? They are forgetting that we are also survivors of sexual assault. And they are silencing us, and they are replicating actually what our traffickers told us. Nobody is going to believe us. They are becoming literally our traffickers now in society. The people who swear to protect us, the people who swear that they were going to advocate for us and protect us, they are the ones who are on the side of the pimps, and they are the ones who open the doors in New York State to protect the pimps. Full decriminalization is not about protecting the people who is being bought and sold. Full decriminalization is about opening the door for pimps, and it's a legislation that protects pimps and traffickers, and that is the reality.
Margot wants to say a few words, and then we'll open it for questions.
Maybe just to say that that evening and night that I follow the police to see how they work on implementing this law. And of course, one law on a ban on the buying of sexual services is not enough. We have understood that there is so much more that has to be done for gender equality, for social services, for all the things, education, all of those things that make up a good society. But that night we came to an apartment where apparently 4 girls from Romania were living together. Only one of them could speak a little English. And with the police came also a social worker. And that's the rule. So when they go out, they also have with them a social worker. And the first thing the police asked was, do you know where you are at all? And they could not answer. The three of them could not answer, but the fourth girl, yeah, she knew, of course, that they were in Stockholm, but do you know the address? Because what if a person comes in, a buyer comes in here and he has a knife and he threatens you with a knife? Could you call for help? And that was not exactly clear. So they immediately, of course, left, they made sure that these girls put on their phones what number to call, the address and everything. They left all the material that they needed to get help. And they gave sort of all the social services. And that's how it should work, of course, you know, if with this kind of legislation that you work hand in hand with the social services and you help those girls to get out, because they are locked in to such a in such an apartment, and they are trafficked there. And this was a way, of course, to start then a process to find also the pimps and to make sure that the buyers are caught. So, and also the police told us about these stories where one girl had both been abused and she had been raped, and the man had also taken her money, and she. I mean, they made sure that she could go through a legal process against this guy also because of the money that he stole them from her. So to give the woman that kind of assistance and help and restore sort of their dignity and ensure that they can enjoy the same legal and other rights is also an important part of work.
Thank you. We can open it up to questions, if anybody has any questions. Oh, I see a hand. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I don't count, because of COVID, I keep it a bit of a distance. I'm a UN representative and dealing with anti-trafficking at the United Nations. And now I was a former district leader here in Manhattan and still with the Democratic clubs. We have been dealing with the trafficking, anti-trafficking work with the legal communities, and yet we do understand what is going on. The issue that I'm going to bring up is dealing with the UN, the Nordic model, and dealing with the other countries, particularly of Ghana, Southeast Asia, where there is a lot of trafficking going on, and some of them coming here. It's not the definitions. How are you going to deal with the models that the Nordic models and the Democratic clubs, or what New Yorkers and other states are saying about these particular models that are working or may not be working, about Germany, and this is the way to go for full decriminalization? From the UN, I say, no way. I understand it better than the average person in these clubs, and I've taken a stand against it. How are you working against dealing with it, with people are so set and going full decriminalization? What are you, the definitions are there. What are you going to do to make the people understand this is not the way to go? It's not working. And they asked for my opinion since I am at the UN. I'm going, it's not working. You cannot even begin to imagine what we are dealing with and across all the member states. Thank you.
Well, if are you talking about the general population? Are you talking about?
Okay, I'm talking about, first of all, the Democratic clubs that you brought up, and I'm, as someone who's been involved for 30 years with it, plus and 30, plus the general population. There is not a very good explanation. The press media do not do a very good job in explaining what is going on overseas. There is a total disconnect, and I've been often, as you well know, been asked to sort of explain or everything. Well, it's too difficult, or it's a complicated subject. You just can't just say this is the way it is, or this is the one.
Right. There are a lot of issues. There is some good coverage happening, but I work with a lot of candidates for office, and I'm always advising them they've got to stand up, and they've got to make the case themselves. And there are legislators who have gone into some of these clubs, and they've taken the time to learn the issue and to learn how to make their case for it, and they're willing to not get the endorsement. And then they're willing to publicize that if it doesn't. So that's one of the answering those questions. But there's a great deal of great legislation that's happening right now that I just want to quickly mention, because it would be fantastic if everybody here could be involved in that. I do want you to think, you've come here tonight, what can you leave and you can do? And one of those things that you can do is you can reach out to 2 friends, 3 friends, make an afternoon of it, make calls and visit your local legislators. They owe you that. And they need to hear from us. They need to hear from not just the advocates, certainly the survivors, but they need to hear from the people who vote for them and who they see walking down the street at the local deli. That's really, really critical. And that's something that's in your power to do. We are working to extend the statute of limitations on human trafficking cases. Currently, it's 5 years. Big problem. We're trying to make them in line with the sex crime statutes. We have a big bill that we have worked on. Dorchen Leitholt is, I don't see her in the room at the moment, but all the work in New York that has happened would not have happened with her. She is the mothership for so much that's happened here. And the public and legislators need to realize that all the work that New York has done, that the legislature has already done and put into place to build an infrastructure, to provide services, to hold people accountable for this, is really going to become ineffective if we fully decriminalize the sex trade. So there's arguing against that, and then these good things that are happening, passing the statute of limitations on that. It's extending services. Right now, the services that mostly exist are for minors. We want to extend it because there's nothing about turning 18 that makes you less worthy of being able to get out of the life and build a new life. So we want to extend that until somebody is 25. Vacating convictions for prostitution. I mean, all the organizations that work to train and do outreach, you know, it's slamming up against a wall when you can't get the actual employment. And then if someone knows that you have these convictions, you're a target again. So I'm going to stop there because I always feel that I'm taking a little too much time.
We do have an online question.
Oh, okay.
I
yes,
think
thank you.
Sonia touched upon it a little bit, but for the other speakers, how do we support and let folks know that support is available for survivors of exploitation?
I heard 2 questions there. So there are a bunch of resource lists. Whoever's controlling the Zoom, I can send links for you to send out to everybody. But there's a bunch of resources for survivors, especially in New York. There's also never enough nationally, but there are organizations, a lot of them survivor-led across the U.S. There's a lot of direct service providers that help survivors that have either exited or are still currently in the life. So there are resources out there that will help survivors if anyone's looking, and I'll share that after this.
I would recommend calling the Human Trafficking Hotline. They can refer you directly to local resources. And here in New York City, actually, something that not a lot of people know, there is something called the Empower Center that it's really helping everyone who is on the sex trade, regardless self-identification. What is the meaning of that? If you refer yourself as a prostitute, as a sex worker, as a human trafficking survivor, regardless of how you self-identify, there are resources for you, legal resources, immigration resources, mental health, physical health, and they are available for everyone who is involved or has been impacted by the sex trade. So I would really recommend everyone, people in need to look out for the Empower Center.
I think this is great. I think I didn't realize the full decriminalization process was there. But so you're saying that there's services for the PTSD of all of this, because I imagine the degree to which there's PTSD from this experience, and there are therapists that are addressing that. And then the second part of my thing is the bigger problem, I think, is for example, the mentality of somebody like Governor DeSantis, who wants to get rid of sex education entirely, and thinks that the parents are going to teach sex education in any kind of positive way in Florida. I think the real fundamental issue here is what kids and boys especially learn. You know, I'm lucky in that I came up in a generation where people were, men and women were exploring their sexuality, and I'd like to believe was a positive way. It never occurred to me I would ever go to a prostitute. So, you know, I don't know how you correct this, but the idea of banning books that deal with sexuality or eliminating sex education for kids is just so appalling to me that no wonder we're having this problem. So I'd like you to comment on that, those two thoughts. I'd like to know more about the PTSD and sex education.
I think your question was, is there resources that are helping the PTSD? Yeah, and like, for example, like the resource that Cristián brought up, the Empower Center, they don't just focus on mental health, they also have medical services, immigration services. If you call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they'll refer you to those types of services, but really, it's just finding that for the PTSD, it's about finding therapists and counselors who specialize in PTSD and complex trauma. So that is definitely out there.
But more importantly, it's the sex education or the anti-sex education ideas that are, again, going right back to what was pre-60s, you know?
We have introduced also a revised curriculum when it comes to sex education in schools. So you have to understand what goes on, for example, also with the sugar dating, because it starts very early. And that's a kind of grooming online, and because you want a new handbag and you think that you can just go out with an older man and he will give you a new handbag, but that's the start of something. And all of these things have to be taught also in school. You have to understand what happens to you at early age. So I think all of these other supporting measures are so important in the educational system, in the social system. So all of those things have to work to be able to change this long term. But we are really up against a very heavily armed and financed enemy here, because there is so much money involved. So they will put up all of their resistance to any change in the law. But I think this is what we have to do, and we can see France, who has also the same legislation as Sweden. And they have also introduced, I would say, a much stronger social part of the legislation. And I think we are going that way as well. I really hope so, even though we have a new government. That is not my government, but...
I'll just add, it's a really important question, and I hope that that's the next front. Obviously, we're going to need, I mean, doing anything with the DOE is difficult, and there needs to be the funding there. I think the first part of that, something that Joyclyn has been very involved in, is you know, the TLC. We did this whole thing with the taxi drivers where they were trained to be able to identify it. That went through the hospital systems. ECPAT USA led the effort to, with airlines and hotels, to be able to have the 800 numbers and for their employees to be able to recognize it. That next frontier is education, because what is happening here in New York City, if Jane Bigglesome were here, who runs the trafficking division at the Covenant House, pimps literally go there and hang out on the street, waiting to be able to meet these young, disadvantaged, homeless people who are sheltering at Covenant House, yes. She's involved in a case right now where a pimp literally put an ad out on Craigslist saying, "Tired of living at the Cov? I've got a nice place for you." I mean, that's what we're up against. There have been cases where the smaller local trafficking ring will pay a younger person who is in that middle school to recruit the girls there. And it's not to do the full recruiting, it's bring them leads. They're like, "Do you want some money?" It's like they give them money for snacks after school. That's where it starts. And then the pimp is hanging out there. That's what we're looking at.
Okay, there's one more question.
Do you think that if people were more open-minded about sex, people would have more sex on a you know, a basis where it was agreement between two adults? Do you think that if our education system were different, then we wouldn't have these houses of prostitution and sex trade and all that? What do you think?
Okay, so personally, I'm going back to what I said earlier about the sex trade not being about sex. There, granted, on the surface, it is a sex buyer that is purchasing sexual access to somebody, but again, the sex education that I know about in New York State schools, and anybody jump in if you've had it differently, is usually about anatomy and learning the body. And then from there, you might, if you're in college and have a really good professor, you might graduate to talk about historical prostitution. But sex education, in my opinion, is irrelevant here, because they're not gonna touch on, let's talk about how you don't purchase sex, or let's talk about how do we have more open-minded or more, inclusive sex so that we're not purchasing people, because these are not the conversations that we're having in society. So whether it's there, sex education is there or not, whether or not somebody's more conservative or if somebody's more liberal, when it comes to their sexual encounters, it's still not addressing the entitlement aspect. It's not addressing the power imbalance and position of vulnerability versus position of authority. It's not addressing those things. It's not addressing racism, patriarchy, capitalism, sexism, and so on and so forth. These things are not included in sex education. So whether or not sex education is there or not, we're still not addressing the root causes of prostitution. We're still not addressing the psychological something that causes or that fuels sex buyers and the demand in them making the choice to continue to purchase sexual access to somebody. So I do think that on the surface, it sounds like this is a sex issue, but I really don't think it is. I think it's beyond that. So really, having such a sex education is, to me, a completely different topic, but.
No, it is totally like the moment that money is involved or something of value is involved, like it's about power and dominance. Like especially when the sex buyers, it's just about it, and like sex, it's just the conduit, like to exert that power and dominance. Like talking about education, I think that we need to really. I'm baffled because I really think that New York it's very bad at education. To be honest, me coming from another country, like I thought that New York education was going to be very good, but I don't see talking about sexual assault, rape to people, trafficking, even to kids. And what we are doing, it's like, let us educate you how to protect you in case of this happen. Instead of educating people are like, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be raping people. You shouldn't be buying people. We are educating people like, oh, how to protect you from all this. So we are normalizing sexual assault, rape, trafficking, the buying of people, instead of educating and preventing that. And this is real. Like, I don't know why we are not doing that, and we should be doing that. On the other part of education, even here, I found it very hard, like even saying sex, penis, vagina, people cringe. I don't even know why. And if I'm going beyond that, there is no sexual education for adults immigrants. There is no sexual education for immigrants who don't speak English. And there's not education at all for the LGBTQ plus community. And this is a big, big issue. Why? The LGBTQ plus community. This is a big issue. Why? The LGBTQ plus community, we suffer from a high rate of sexual assault and rape. The problem with this is that because nobody's talking about this is not being addressed, we normalize it. It's like, okay, we are being raped in our families, in our circle, by our friends, in a school, everywhere. Guess what? A sex buyer come and it's now telling you like, well, this has been happening to you their whole life, but guess what? Now I'm going to give you money. Get what is going to be the shift. It's going to be like, oh, wait, it's true. Like my whole life, I have been assaulted. Nobody has ever told me caring about me, but now this person is going to give me money. So the shift is now coming, oh, so now I can live out of this. Nobody's talking about this. Nobody's addressing about this. Why? Because we don't care about the LGBTQ plus community. We don't care about sexual education. We don't care about prevention. We don't care about trafficking. We don't care about going beyond. We are very lazy, and we just want to keep this title about, oh, I'm progressive enough just because I can use certain words. We need to go beyond what are the issues. If we really want to tackle sex trafficking, we really need to educate ourselves, educate our communities to really understand how trafficking, prostitution is linked with femicide, homicide, with transphobia, homophobia, how it's killing immigrants, women, like how this is not only a transgender issue. And again, it's not only a transgender issue, it's a human right issue because people are dying. And we know that it's a gender issue because women are the most affected of it. And the ones that need to be on the forefront are women. And this is not about silencing anyone, but the most affected by it are women here in the United States and on a global scale. And I think that this is very, very important to highlight. Not because I am a male, I'm a survivor. That doesn't mean that I need to be fighting with, oh, but our voices are not being heard. No, we can work together and we can continue like educating the world and we can do a better work. And if we want to do it in our generation, we really are doing it bad. We really need to start working and really, really talking against all these people that are trying to normalize like sexual assault, rape, sex trafficking, and especially like buying people. Buying people is totally not okay.
Can I just add to his list also? I'm going to acknowledge Carolyn's hand. I just want to add to Cristián's list that if we're talking about education, we also need to talk about or educate, ask the question, why are we equating money with consent? Sonia said, how can you reckon the Me Too movement but not reckon prostitution, right? The reality is that I'm gonna say that we all in this room support the Me Too movement. But we as society understands and we stand with the survivor that was date raped or drugged or roofied on a campus party, and we support the survivor that threw her mattress over in protest of campus sexual assault, and we all understand that. But the minute that same girl that threw her mattress was left $100 on the dresser, now all of a sudden the conversation switches and becomes her choice. We need to be talking about why is it that the presence of $1 makes that assault, that rape, that encounter any less different than those who have been sexually assaulted. So I think if we are gonna talk about education, we should be asking those questions and not just focusing on the body parts. And I do agree that we need to call the body parts out as they are. We keep trying to sugarcoat, and I think if I asked every woman in this room what they grew up hearing their genitalia called, we would all have a different answer because we're just straying away from the language. I think if we want to change the cultural perspective and narrative, we just need to call things out as it is. Stop buying people, stop paying for other human bodies, stop commodifying individuals, and call your body parts out and call the acts what it is. If it's rape, it's rape. If there's $100 there after they rape you, it's paid rape. We need to just continue to go that route, and then our society will begin to shift.
One last comment from
Very last.
the foreign.
Well, I think you should come to Sweden because I think we have an excellent sex education in school, and you must not underestimate how important this is, because children have to understand something about their own bodies, what is happening to them, and to understand also some of these modern phenomena that wants to draw them into something maybe that they don't like. And also, I have an idea. Why don't we find a model for? Why don't we create that curriculum for sex education? How would we like to see it work? And I know that even in preschool in Sweden, small children say "stopp min kropp," meaning stop. This is my body. They learn to not accept, kind of sexual, what do you call it? Yeah, when the sexual touches or when they are made a sort of a victim of this. And I think that we should look at what would be the ideal way of talking about this and learning it in schools as well. And we have good models, and that includes also these modern phenomena. So that can and must be done, because this is also where it starts. Everybody goes to school.
Well, thank you so much, extraordinary panel.
May I ask a
Carolyn.
question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Jessica Newworth and Hunter College for providing this forum tonight. It was very insightful and thoughtful. And all of the panelists, particularly the survivors, your stories really put the crux and the truth there. But ultimately, this decision is not going to be made in schools. It's going to be made in the legislature. And I would say that it is a fight that we are losing. We have the chairman of the Health Committee that has come out for full decriminalization, the chairwoman of the Labor Committee that has come out in the New York State Legislature for full decriminalization. We have our own outstanding Senator, Liz Krueger, who has come out to protect survivors and to protect people from exploitation. But the momentum and the wave is going in the other direction. And this forum helped me understand one of the reasons why, and why we have to fight back with the same tools. Those that the chairman of the Labor Committee and Health Committee are listening to, they are asking candidates and rating them, endorsing them, fighting for them, putting out literature and money behind their candidates, and we're not doing the same on the other side. We need someone who will rate them and put the story out and say this legislator is for exploitation, for buying bodies, for all of the language that you were using today, and throw it out there to the general public. I think the general public is on the side of truly protecting people and giving them opportunities. But the wave is going in the other way. And Sonia, I think your question pointed out that they have questions and rating systems on their side. We're not doing the same on our side. And I think that's something we have to clearly take it out into an election and focus really on electing people who are going to fight for our two survivors and not for the exploitation of bodies. And I want to thank the visiting scholars so much from Sweden who give us the international perspective of what it has happened in countries that have respected human rights, truly respected them, and those that have brought exploitation, and the fact that it brings in more exploitation, more sex trafficking, and that story has to get out. But ultimately, it comes down to elections. And if we're not going to put out and fight for our candidates, and they're fighting and pushing and endorsing and killing people who speak out on our side, then we're going to lose. And right now, I don't know a major committee chair. Liz Krueger is a major committee chair. But it's astonishing that in the great liberal state of New York, you have two chairmen who are for total decriminalization after you heard from two survivors what has meant to the destruction of human life and those problems. So I just wanted to point it out. I think it's ultimately a political one, and it ultimately comes down to elections. And I yield back.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone, especially Melanie, for this incredibly powerful film and for just sharing all of your. And I think that Congresswoman Maloney has really given us our marching orders. I think that, well, we've gotten a lot of marching orders tonight, and I think we have to think about all of them because really, this is our state, and we do have the power of the vote, and we've got to use it. And I just have to say, one of the issues here that we didn't discuss a lot is the money, and all the money's on the other side of this issue, and it's because this is a multi-billion or trillion-dollar industry. There's a lot riding on this industry. It's not like some of the other issues we deal with. So, you know, you have David here and Goliath over there, but I do have a lot of faith in New York, and I really think that voices like these are going to change everything. And so I'm glad Melanie's on fire. I think we're all on fire now, and I want to invite you, I want to thank you again and invite you to join us and continue the discussion upstairs on the ground floor, the Four Freedoms room, where we have a reception. Thanks.